Welcome to Miss Marple Mystery, where quiet English lanes hide deadly secrets. One stranger waits past midnight, and by dawn, someone lies dead. Who do you suspect in this village of whispers? Where are you listening from? Let us know in the comments. The clock in Mary Mead struck 11, its mellow chime drifting across the sleeping village like a lullaby. The air was still, the cobblestone lanes glistening faintly beneath the thin silver of moonlight. Only the faint rustle of autumn leaves disturbed the silence. To most of the villagers, it was an ordinary night, but to Miss Jane Marple, seated by her lace-curtained window with a cup of cocoa, something felt distinctly unordinary. She had seen him an hour ago, a stranger, standing near the old post office, partly obscured by the shadows of the elm trees. He wasn't from the village. Of that she was certain. His posture was too tense, his clothes too fine for someone merely passing through. He had waited there, motionless, glancing now and again toward the road that led to the railway station. Miss Marple had intended to draw the curtains and forget the sight. After all, it wasn't unusual for travelers to lose their way. Yet something about the stillness in his stance, the deliberate patience of it, stirred her curiosity. She had learned over the years that the most dangerous sort of people often waited quietly. By midnight, the lane was empty. The stranger had vanished. But the next morning, Mrs. Weatherby's scream shattered the calm of the village. It came from the edge of the churchyard, near the old lick gate, where the vicar's lamp had gone out sometime after midnight. There, beneath the yew trees, lay the same man Miss Marple had seen from her window. His face was pale, his eyes half open as if surprised by death itself. A single wound marked his chest, precise, clean, and final. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived from the nearby market town, the village was already buzzing. The baker swore he had seen a motorcar parked on the lane around 11:30. Mrs. Price from the general store insisted she'd heard voices outside her window shortly before midnight. And young Tommy Briggs, the paperboy, claimed he'd noticed a woman's handkerchief fluttering near the gate just before dawn. Miss Marple listened to it all with her usual mild expression, nodding thoughtfully as the inspector made notes. She asked for no attention, though her mind had already begun sorting through the details, the angle of the wound, the stranger's shoes, the peculiar absence of a watch or wallet. Someone had been careful. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Looks like robbery, perhaps," said Inspector Craddock, glancing up. "Though it's odd, no one heard a struggle." "People rarely struggle," Miss Marple murmured softly, "when the killer is someone they trust." The inspector frowned, but said nothing. He was used to her gentle interjections, the ones that later proved devastatingly accurate. That afternoon, as the body was taken away and the villagers returned to their gossip, Miss Marple strolled past the churchyard once more. A small scrap of paper caught her eye, half buried in the grass. She stooped delicately and picked it up. It was torn from a railway timetable, the 10:45 from Paddington to Much Benham. Scribbled across the margin, faintly in pencil, were two words: "Past midnight." Miss Marple tucked it neatly into her handbag and smiled to herself. It was, she thought, going to be a most interesting day. Miss Marple returned home before luncheon, set the railway scrap beside her saucer, and let her needles click while she rearranged the morning's impressions. The stranger's polished shoes had a London make, the soles scarcely scuffed, suggesting the village was not his destination but his stage. Past midnight, he had written, or someone had written for him. A rendezvous, or a warning. She threaded a new skein and reflected that people who wait so openly usually expect to be met by someone who prefers not to be seen arriving. Most folks hide in shadows. Guilty ones often invite the shadows to hide them. At 1:30, the vicar's wife, Grace Clement, arrived with a flurry of sympathy and local news. The motorcar reported by the baker belonged, she said, to Mr. Lionel Harcourt of Old Hatch, a gentleman farmer with a taste for fast things and slower accounts. Grace was too kind to repeat gossip, so she mentioned it twice. Miss Marple poured tea and asked about the church lamp. It had been refilled the previous afternoon. Odd, then, that it should gutter so early unless someone had wanted deep shadow. Grace blinked at that, then added that Mr. Harcourt had been working late with figures, which in Mary Mead could mean anything from a ledger to a lady. Inspector Craddock presented himself shortly after, a courteous knock, and the respectful stance of a man who knew wisdom when it wore wool. He asked what she had seen from her window. "Only that our visitor was waiting," she said. He was patient, like a person following instructions. She did not mention the timetable yet. It is useful, she had learned, to keep one small card unplayed. Craddock noted the hour and asked whether any lady might have passed. Miss Marple thought of the handkerchief the boy had found and of perfumes that came from shops with carpets, not flagstones. A lady could pass anywhere if she wished not to be discussed, she murmured, and poured him tea. By 3 o'clock the village had decided the dead man was a thief. Mr. Harcourt declared as much at the Crown and Thistle, adding that such types came from London to scout empty houses. He had been home all evening, he told anyone who asked, balancing accounts with his housekeeper, Mrs. Rudge, who never contradicted him in public. Miss Marple knew that alibis acquired on the premises of pride often crumble when a smaller truth is pressed upon them. Maids remember doorbells, and cats remember opened gates. She walked to the post office, where Mrs. Fowler, who had run it since stamps had queens upon them, recalled a telegram delivered yesterday to Old Hatch. Arrival confirmed. Wait at church. No signature, only a London address from Bloomsbury. Mrs. Fowler remembered because the boy had smudged the word church, making it search, which she corrected. Small clerical mistakes often expose careful crimes, Miss Marple reflected. People precise in wickedness are rarely precise with ink. Outside, a brisk gust lifted the hedge and sent a small rectangle skittering across the lane. She pinned it beneath her sensible heel. A claim ticket from Paddington left luggage, dated the previous evening. The number was legible. The ink damp bled as if folded in haste. She slipped it into her handbag beside the timetable and continued to the churchyard. There she paused, where the lamp had failed. Wax, brittle and pale, lay in a crescent near the post. Someone had snuffed the flame with a gloved hand. Privacy, she thought, is a tidy habit when one intends untidiness. At twilight, the inspector convened a modest gathering in the vicar's hall. Mr. Harcourt, Mrs. Rudge, Mrs. Price from the general store, the baker, and young Tommy Briggs, who seemed to swell with importance like dough in a warm kitchen. Craddock asked about the motor car. Harcourt repeated his account calmly. Yet when Tommy mentioned a second car nosing the station road after midnight, a dark saloon with a dented wing, Harcourt's eyelid ticked once. Mrs. Rudge clasped her ring of keys so tightly they left half-moons in her palm. "Robbery," Harcourt proposed again. The Londoner bungled it and paid the price. Miss Marple observed his cuffs, faintly chalked. A mark village farmers did not acquire on a Thursday, unless sorting papers. And she remembered the telegram's prim instruction. Wait at church. Grace Clement entered with the handkerchief in a paper bag. White lawn, a tiny crown embroidered in blue. Shop bought, Mrs. Price declared. But dear. Miss Marple traced the corner where a single thread had pulled free. It carried a breath of violet city sweetness, not hedgerow. She thought of Bloomsbury and of women who wear gloves even in July, and of men who borrow courage from the night. "Inspector," she said gently, "if a person were expected past midnight, might not the inviter grow anxious when midnight came and went? Anxious people tidy. They extinguish. They remove." Craddock studied her. "You think our killer met him here by appointment?" She smiled. "One doesn't snuff a lamp for burglary. One snuffs a lamp for privacy." When the others had been dismissed, Miss Marple waited by the hall's notice board and addressed Mrs. Rudge in a voice as mild as milk. "I do hope Mr. Harcourt's figures came out right. Balancing ledgers is so exhausting. One loses track of hours. The housekeeper's eyes flickered. "We were at it together," she said. "All evening." "How diligent," Miss Marple replied. "And yet there was time for a telegram from London, and time for a gentleman to travel, and time for someone to forget that lamps do not snuff themselves." Mrs. Rudge's keys chimed faintly as she turned away. Miss Marple watched the woman's back and thought, not for the first time, that guilt is a posture long before it is a confession. The following morning dawned pale and misty, as if the village itself wished to hide from whatever truth was taking shape. Miss Marple rose early, long before the milk cart rattled through the lanes, and sat by her window once more, the morning light tracing a thin silver line across her knitting basket. Her thoughts circled back to Mrs. Rudge, the careful, quiet housekeeper whose hands trembled slightly when speaking of ledgers, whose eyes darted too quickly when mention of telegrams arose. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to leap toward certainty. Guilty people could act calm, and innocent ones could tremble. After breakfast, she made a short call to the vicarage under the guise of returning a borrowed gardening book. Grace Clement greeted her warmly but with visible strain. The excitement of the murder had unsettled even her nerves. "It's dreadful, Jane," she whispered, lowering her voice. "The whole village is gossiping. They say the stranger was seen earlier that day in Much Benham, asking after someone here, but no one knows who." Miss Marple listened, her expression polite, her eyes slightly narrowed in thought. "People rarely visit villages without a name on their tongue," she said softly. "And yet, if one's purpose was private, perhaps even shameful, one might be cautious not to speak it aloud." Grace frowned. "Do you think he came to meet someone of good reputation?" "Reputation," Miss Marple replied, "is often a veil, dear. It hides what people most wish never to be known." She left the vicarage soon after and strolled toward Old Hatch. The fields were slick with dew, the hedges full of gossiping sparrows. As she reached the gate, she paused to study the gravel drive well swept, except for one patch where the stones were disturbed, as though a vehicle had turned sharply in the night. A single heel mark rested beside the track, narrow, pointed, unmistakably a woman's. It led a few steps toward the back of the house and stopped abruptly. "Mrs. Rudge" answered the door, startled but courteous. Her apron was spotless, though the lines under her eyes seemed deeper. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice a shade too quick. "Mr. Harcourt's gone into the village. If it's about the dreadful business, he's already told the inspector everything." "Oh, I've no doubt he has," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, peering past her into the narrow hall. "Such terrible times. One forgets the smallest things, doesn't one? Lamps unlit, doors left ajar, telegrams misplaced." Mrs. Rudge stiffened. "I don't know anything about telegrams." "Of course not, my dear," Miss Marple murmured kindly, "though I expect one was delivered here yesterday afternoon, addressed to Mr. Harcourt. I imagine he was expecting someone. It's such a comfort, having old friends visit unexpectedly, though not quite so comfortingly, in this case." The housekeeper's lips parted, but before she could speak, the growl of a motor car echoed up the drive. Mr. Harcourt had returned. He stepped out briskly, hat low, eyes cool. "Miss Marple," he said with a faint smile, "inspecting my flower beds, are we?" "Your flowers are lovely," she replied. "They always have been. Though I confess I'm more interested in what grows in shadows than in sunlight." He laughed lightly, but there was no humor in, "You sound like the inspector. He was here again this morning, asking about the visitor." I told him the truth. I'd never seen the man before in my life. "Honesty," Miss Marple said, "is a curious thing, Mr. Harcourt. It often begins where people believe lies have already done their work." For the briefest instant, something flickered in his expression, annoyance, or perhaps fear, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "You'll have to excuse me," he said sharply. "I've work to do." As he strode inside, Miss Marple lingered by the door. Her gaze fell to the porch step, where a thin smear of wax glistened in the morning light, the same brittle residue she'd found near the church lamp. Someone had used the same candle both places. That was no coincidence. Later, as she walked back toward the lane, she met Inspector Craddock coming from the opposite direction. "I've just been to the station," he said. "The London police traced the claim. Ticket you gave me." The locker contained a small valise, mostly clothes but also a photograph, taken some years ago, of a woman in evening dress. On the back, in a man's hand, the words, "To my dearest L, forever past midnight." Miss Marple stopped walking. "Forever past midnight," she repeated softly. So the phrase was a promise. "Or a threat," Craddock said grimly. "We're trying to identify her now. There's a faint watermark from a photographer's studio in Bloomsbury." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant. Bloomsbury again. The same address as the telegram. "You see, Inspector, it's all quite tidy. Someone came from London to end an affair that should never have begun." He looked at her sharply. "You think the woman in the photograph is connected to someone here?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I think she is someone here. Only, she's been careful, very careful, to appear nothing of the sort." As Craddock walked away, Miss Marple's gaze returned toward the mist-shrouded outline of Old Hatch. A curtain moved faintly in an upper window, and she thought she saw the glimmer of blue, the exact shade of embroidery on the handkerchief. By the time evening shadows crept across the rooftops of Mary Mead, a restlessness had settled over the village. Conversations paused when doors opened, curtains fluttered at the slightest sound, and every glance carried an unspoken question: who was the woman in the photograph? Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly by her parlour fire, reviewing the pattern forming in her mind. The words, "forever past midnight," clung to her thoughts like cobweb silk, delicate but binding, a promise of love or a signal of betrayal. Both had equal potential to end in murder. Her solitude was interrupted by a hesitant knock. When she opened the door, she found young Tommy Briggs shifting from foot to foot, clutching his cap. "Evenin', Miss Marple," he muttered. "Mum," said I. "Shouldn't come. But, well, I thought you'd want to know. I saw Mr. Harcourt again, near the churchyard. He was looking at the gate, where that poor man was found. Proper pale he looked, too. Did he see you, Tommy?" "No, ma'am." I stayed quiet, behind the hedge. He dropped something, though a bit of paper. I couldn't read much of it, but it had a woman's name on it. Looked like Lydia or Lillian, maybe. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "You've done very well, Tommy. Very observant indeed. You must promise not to tell anyone else just yet." She sent him off with a peppermint and returned to her chair, turning over the name in her mind. Lydia, Lillian, both names with London airs about them. Either could be the L in the inscription. The next morning, Inspector Craddock arrived, looking brisk but tired. "You were right about the connection to Bloomsbury," he said, sitting down. "The woman in the photograph has been identified. Lydia Harcourt. Mr. Harcourt's late wife." "Late?" Miss Marple repeated. "I was not aware she had passed away." "She hasn't," said the inspector grimly. "At least, not officially. She disappeared 3 years ago after leaving her husband. There was talk of a man, a solicitor named Peter Ashcroft, but no charges, no evidence. Harcourt claimed she ran off with him. Now Ashcroft's name appears on the stranger's papers. We think the dead man was Ashcroft." Miss Marple folded her hands, the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. Then the circle closes rather neatly. A husband left behind, a wife vanished with another man, and after years of silence, the man returns to meet someone in the shadows of midnight. Craddock sighed, and ends up stabbed through the heart. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "That's the difficulty with passion. Inspector, it rarely ages gracefully." They walked together toward Old Hatch once more. Harcourt was, in his study, seated behind his desk, the calmness of a man who had practiced composure as an art. "I was fond of my wife once," he said, when confronted, "but she destroyed that fondness with deceit. I've built my life since then on truth my own." "Yet you received a telegram from her lover," said Craddock, watching closely. "He meant to see you, or her." Harcourt gave a thin smile. "If you imagine I invited him here, you're mistaken. I didn't even know he was alive." Miss Marple leaned forward gently. "And yet the message said, 'Wait at church.' That hardly sounds accidental. You see, I believe Mr. Ashcroft didn't come here to seek forgiveness. He came for closure. Perhaps he knew something about your wife's disappearance that you preferred remain buried." Harcourt's jaw tightened. "You're suggesting I killed him." "I suggest only that the truth resists being hidden," Miss Marple replied softly. The tension in the room hung like dust in sunlight. Craddock broke it with a cough. "We'll need you to remain available, Mr. Harcourt. There are questions still unanswered." As they left, Miss Marple noticed a framed photograph on the mantel, not of Lydia, but of a younger woman, plain yet pleasant, with intelligent eyes. "Mrs. Rudge," she said quietly as they walked away. "I recognize that face at once, though she's changed a little. I wonder if the inspector realized it." Craddock looked puzzled. "His housekeeper?" "Indeed," said Miss Marple, her tone thoughtful. "Her first name is Lily, is it not? That's a form of Lydia, and if one wished to disappear without truly vanishing, what better way than to reappear under a simpler name, in the very house one once ruled as mistress?" Craddock stopped in his tracks. "You mean Mrs. Rudge is Lydia Harcourt?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People often return to the scene of their unhappiness, Inspector, especially those who wish to see whether their sins have been forgotten." That night, as the wind rose over the moors, Miss Marple sat once again by her fire, the pieces of the puzzle aligning: a stranger from London, a husband haunted by pride, and a wife hiding in plain sight. Somewhere among them lay the truth and the reason someone had waited past midnight. Inspector Craddock did not sleep much that night, and neither did Miss Marple. The storm that rolled across Mary Mead kept shutters rattling and minds awake. By morning, the rain had washed the village clean, leaving only glistening cobblestones and a sharp chill in the air. Miss Marple took her tea by the window and watched the postman cycle past. The world seemingly normal again, except for one fact. If Mrs. Rudge was indeed Lydia Harcourt, then the entire story told by her husband had been a carefully arranged fiction. And fiction, Miss Marple knew, always contained a truth disguised as convenience. After breakfast, she made her way to the churchyard, umbrella in hand. The wet grass muffled her steps as she paused near the lich gate where the stranger had died. The rain had revealed things the earlier search had missed: a faint trail of shoe prints, partly washed away, leading from the hedge toward the lane. One print was distinctly feminine, the heel narrow, the toe delicate. She bent closer and saw a faint streak of reddish mud on the stone wall beside it. Not blood paint. Someone had brushed against something freshly painted that night. She filed the thought away, her mind quietly knitting possibilities like stitches in a shawl. She was still there when Inspector Craddock appeared, looking weary but alert. "I had her followed," he said, joining her beneath the dripping trees. "Mrs. Rudge or Lydia left Old Hatch early this morning. She went to Much Benham and withdrew £50 from a savings account under her real name." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "that suggests a plan. Perhaps even an escape." "Perhaps," Craddock agreed. "She's now at the station, waiting for the 10 o'clock train to London. I could stop her." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not yet, my dear Inspector. Let her believe she's safe. The guilty are never so revealing as when they think they've escaped notice." They walked together toward the road. "Do you truly believe she killed Ashcroft?" Craddock asked. Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed ahead. "I believe she feared something, or someone. But fear does not always make one a murderer. No, this is a tangle of pride and passion. And pride, Inspector, often carries a knife sharper than hatred." By noon, word spread that Mrs. Rudge had returned to Old Hatch unexpectedly. Mr. Harcourt, it seemed, had fallen ill, a sudden fainting spell, brought on. So the maid said, by the excitement. Miss Marple found the timing far too convenient. She walked there at once, armed with the mild authority that made even the most defensive souls yield before her politeness. She found Mrs. Rudge in the drawing room, the curtains half drawn, the air heavy with lavender and anxiety. The woman turned pale when she saw Miss Marple. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "It's not a good time." "I imagine it isn't," Miss Marple said kindly. "You must be dreadfully tired of keeping so many secrets, my dear. It wears on one, doesn't it?" Mrs. Rudge's hand tightened on the back of a chair. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, but you do," Miss Marple replied softly. "I think you've known for 3 years that your husband would never forgive your leaving him. I think you came back here under another name, believing that by serving him you could erase your past. And then Peter Ashcroft returned a man who might expose everything." For a moment, the only sound was the steady ticking of the mantel clock. Then Mrs. Rudge sank into the chair, her voice trembling. "I didn't kill him. I swear it. I met him, yes, at the church. He wanted money. He said he'd go to Lionel and tell him the truth unless I paid. I gave him what I could, all I'd saved. Then he left me there, alive." Miss Marple nodded gently. "And the candle? The lamp that was snuffed out? I thought someone might see us," she said weakly. "I only wanted the dark." Before Miss Marple could reply, a sharp noise echoed from the hall, a heavy thud, followed by hurried footsteps. Inspector Craddock burst in, face grim. "Harcourt's gone," he said. "His car's missing. One of the maids saw him leave by the side gate not 15 minutes ago." Miss Marple rose, eyes steady. "He's going to the station. He's realized she tried to leave, and he's not going there to forgive her." The inspector moved toward the door, but Miss Marple's voice stopped him. "Not the station platform," she said. "The old goods yard behind it. There's shelter there, private, quiet, just the sort of place one would choose to end an argument unseen." Craddock hesitated only a moment before hurrying out. Miss Marple followed at her own measured pace, her umbrella tapping rhythmically against the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded long, mournful, and far too late for the 10 o'clock departure. As she reached the end of the lane, she saw Craddock's figure ahead, framed against the cold iron of the goods yard gates. Inside, under the dull sky, Lionel Harcourt stood motionless beside his car. At his feet, a valise lay open, its contents spilling into the mud. Women's clothing, a photograph, and a small silver locket cracked in two. Miss Marple stopped a few paces away, her expression unreadable. "Pride, Mr. Harcourt," she said gently. "It always ends where love once began." Lionel Harcourt did not answer at once. He stood motionless beside the car, his hands clenched on the door frame, his eyes fixed on the broken locket in the mud. The wind tugged at his coat, and the sound of the distant train faded into a low moan across the fields. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, stripped of all its usual control. "I didn't kill him," he said, "but I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to." Inspector Craddock took a cautious step forward. "Then perhaps you'll tell us what happened after midnight." Harcourt's shoulders sagged. "He wrote to me weeks ago, Ashcroft. Said Lydia wanted to see me one last time. I thought it was some cruel game. Then another message came, this time from her, or so it seemed. She said she'd be waiting at the church, that she couldn't bear the lies any longer." He laughed bitterly. "But when I arrived, there was only him. Smug, confident. He said Lydia had no interest in reconciliation, that she'd been living nearby under another name. He wanted money for his silence. I refused. We argued, yes, but I left him alive." "Alive?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "And yet, not long after, he was dead where you met him." Harcourt turned sharply toward her. "I tell you, I didn't touch him again." Miss Marple regarded him steadily, her gaze calm and unflinching. "You may not have," she said, but someone did. And I think the real question, Mr. Harcourt, is who else knew about that meeting? Because it seems to me that the person who sent you both those messages was not Lydia or Peter, but someone who wanted you to confront each other in precisely that place. Craddock frowned. You mean someone forged both letters? Precisely, she replied. A careful mind, aware of the history between them, and clever enough to exploit it. That person knew that passion and pride would do the rest. The inspector looked thoughtful. But who would benefit from both men meeting? And why kill Ashcroft rather than Harcourt? Miss Marple's expression grew, distant. Perhaps because Ashcroft carried the truth, and truth is a dangerous thing to those who live by deception. She glanced at the open valise. Among the scattered garments lay a folded sheet of paper, its edges water-stained. She stooped and picked it up carefully. A letter, she murmured, written by Lydia's hand. But unfinished. She began to read softly. Lionel, I have watched you from near and far, and I know you will never forgive me, but I cannot let him ruin what little peace remains. The letter ended abruptly, the ink smeared where the pen had been snatched away. Craddock exhaled slowly. So she meant to write to him. Perhaps Ashcroft found her before she finished. Or, Miss Marple said quietly, someone found them both. A shout came from the far end of the yard. One of the constables was running toward them, something small and gleaming in his hand. Found this near the fence, sir, he called out. A brooch broken. Clasp. Looks like it's been stepped on. Miss Marple took it delicately, examining the filigree pattern. Violet enamel, she said. A pretty thing, though rather too fine for a servant's wage. I believe I've seen it before on Mrs. Rudge's collar. Craddock's eyes narrowed. Then she was here. She was, Miss Marple agreed, though not, I think, for murder. She came to stop it. She loved him still, you see, her husband, despite everything. But she was too late. And whoever struck that fatal blow did so while she hid in the shadows. Harcourt stared at her, his face ashen. Then who else? Miss Marple folded her hands. The simplest answer is often the one least expected. There was another person with cause to silence the past, someone who depended on your good opinion, perhaps even your affection. Someone who feared that Lydia's truth would destroy everything she'd so carefully built. Grace Clement, Craddock, breathed. The vicar's wife. Miss Marple's eyes met his. She was Lydia's cousin, was she not? And you recall how quickly she knew of the motor car, the telegram, even the stranger's arrival. A woman of delicate propriety, but deep emotion. She's kept Lydia's secret these 3 years, and now she's decided how it must end. Craddock turned toward his men. Bring her in, he ordered grimly. But Miss Marple remained still, her gaze thoughtful. No, Inspector, she said softly. We'll go to her. People like Mrs. Clement do not run. They wait, just as he waited past midnight. As they left the yard, the wind swept through the empty space, scattering the last remnants of the broken locket into the mud. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter. She had seen too often how love curdled into vengeance, and how vengeance disguised itself as virtue. The truth was close now, close enough that she could almost feel it stirring beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. The walk to the vicarage was slow and deliberate, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Miss Marple's small figure led the way along the winding path, her umbrella tucked neatly under her arm, while Inspector Craddock followed in brooding silence. He had dealt with many criminals, but the thought of confronting the vicar's wife, a woman known for her charity and calm voice in Sunday readings, seemed almost absurd. Yet Miss Marple's intuition rarely erred. They reached the vicarage just as the first drops began to fall. Grace Clement opened the door herself. Her expression was serene, though her hands were clasped tightly, knuckles pale. Miss Marple, Inspector, she said softly. Your early visitors. Has there been news? Indeed there has, Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. May we come in? It's a dreadful morning for standing at the door. Grace hesitated, then stepped aside. The drawing room was neat, almost too neat, every cushion plumped, every photograph precisely angled. A faint scent of violets lingered in the air, the same perfume Miss Marple had noticed on the handkerchief. Craddock remained near the door, while Miss Marple seated herself in the armchair opposite Grace. "You've always been so kind," Miss Marple began, her knitting bag resting quietly on her lap, "especially to those who've fallen on hard times. I remember how you cared for Mrs. Harcourt after she left." Grace's eyes flickered, but her smile did not falter. "Poor Lydia," she said softly. "She was impulsive, but she deserved pity, not condemnation." "Pity," Miss Marple repeated, watching her closely. "Yes. That's a sentiment often used to disguise deeper feelings. Tell me, Mrs. Clement, when you saw her again, did you still feel pity?" The color drained from Grace's face. "Saw her again?" she echoed faintly. "Oh, don't trouble to deny it," Miss Marple said kindly. "You went to Old Hatch last week. The maid saw you speaking with Mrs. Rudge in the garden. You've known for some time that Lydia was alive. I imagine it was you who persuaded her to stay silent to spare Lionel from scandal." Grace's composure trembled. She pressed a handkerchief to her lips, her breath unsteady. "It wasn't like that," she whispered. "I wanted peace for all of us. If people discovered she'd been here all along, your husband's position would suffer." Miss Marple finished softly. "The vicar's wife, shielding an adulteress. Quite the scandal." Craddock took a step forward, his voice firm. "Mrs. Clement, we found your cousin's brooch at the scene, the one with violet enamel." Grace's hand froze mid-motion. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, very quietly, she lowered the handkerchief. "I didn't mean to kill him," she said. "I swear it. I only wanted him to stop tormenting her." "Miss," Marple nodded, her eyes grave but compassionate. "Tell us, my dear. How did it happen?" Grace's voice faltered as she spoke, yet the words came in a steady stream, as if she had rehearsed them in sleepless hours. "He came to the vicarage first, bold as brass, asking for Lydia. I told him she was gone, that she wanted nothing from him. He laughed, said he had letters, proof she'd been living under another name, that he'd expose her and Lionel both. I followed him to the churchyard. He didn't even see me there until I spoke. I only meant to plead with him." She paused, trembling. "He mocked me, said virtue was a costume for women who'd never been loved. He pushed me aside. I struck him. I didn't even realize the knife had gone so deep." Craddock looked grim. "The knife from the church supper drawer, I suppose." "Yes," she whispered. "I thought if I could make it look like robbery." She broke off, covering her face. "I loved them both, in different ways. Lydia, for her weakness. Lionel, for what she destroyed in him. I only wanted silence." The room fell quiet, except for the faint ticking of the clock. Miss Marple rose slowly, setting aside her knitting bag. "You see, Inspector," she said softly, "it was never hatred that killed Peter Ashcroft, only misguided mercy. She thought she was saving souls when she was only condemning her own." Grace looked up, tears bright in her eyes. Will they pity me?" Miss Marple's expression was kind, but her voice carried quiet finality. "Perhaps," she said, "but pity, Mrs. Clement, is only another form of judgment." Outside, the rain began to fall harder, tapping against the windows like the echo of distant footsteps. As Inspector Craddock led the vicar's wife away, Miss Marple lingered by the doorway, gazing into the grey morning. She had seen this pattern too often, the delicate embroidery of deceit, unraveling thread by thread until nothing remained but truth, bare and unforgiving. The confession spread through Mary Mead like smoke through thatched rafters, slow at first, then unstoppable. By the next morning, the villagers spoke of nothing else. The vicar's wife, gentle Mrs. Clement, the picture of decency and devotion, had been taken away in a police motorcar. Some swore she'd gone white as a ghost, others that she'd looked strangely calm, as if relieved to have laid down a burden too heavy to bear. But as Miss Marple knew, truth rarely ended with confession, it only began there. The inspector returned to her cottage just after breakfast, his face drawn but respectful. "It's over, Miss Marple," he said. She admitted it all. Her fingerprints were on the knife, her brooch at the scene. Every piece fits. Miss Marple set down her teacup, regarding him with a look of quiet concern. "And yet, Inspector, something still troubles you. You don't believe she meant to kill him, and neither do I. But you also don't believe she was entirely alone that night, do you?" Craddock hesitated, rubbing his chin. "It's the timeline," he said finally. "The vicar's wife left the vicarage around midnight. Ashcroft was likely killed between 12:15 and 12:30. But the post-mortem shows he'd eaten something recently. Fruit, perhaps, or jam. That doesn't fit with her account. He'd have had no reason to linger there eating. It's as if he'd gone somewhere else, or someone had brought him something before the quarrel." Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. "Fruit, you say? Perhaps cherries?" Craddock blinked. "Yes. How did you?" "I noticed a stain on his cuff when I saw the body," she said gently. "A deep red smear that wasn't blood. It looked like cherry syrup. Now, there are few places in this village where one might find such a thing after dark, save for Mrs. Price's pantry at the general store. And Mrs. Price, you recall, mentioned hearing voices outside her window before midnight." The inspector frowned. "You think someone lured him there first?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that someone was very careful to make sure the blame fell on a woman who would not defend herself. You see, Mrs. Clement's guilt suits more than one person's purpose." Craddock leaned forward. "You mean Harcourt?" Miss Marple gave a small, almost regretful nod. "He had every reason to want Ashcroft dead, and perhaps even to see his wife punished for it. You see, he's not a man who forgives humiliation. Lydia's disappearance wounded his pride more deeply than any heart could suffer. To discover she'd been living as his housekeeper under his nose was a cruelty his vanity could not endure. Grace's confession saves him twice over, from scandal and from suspicion." The inspector exhaled sharply. "But if Harcourt killed Ashcroft, why would Grace confess?" "Because she believes she did it," Miss Marple said softly. "When she struck him, she may have wounded him, perhaps not fatally. He fell. She fled, believing him dead, but someone followed her. Someone who finished what she began. The neatness of the wound, the missing watch, the snuffed lamp, it all speaks of planning, not passion. That was Harcourt's doing." Craddock looked grim. "You think he found Ashcroft afterward and made sure he didn't rise again?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "And then he waited to see whom fate would point toward the gallows. When Grace confessed, he let her. A tidy man, Mr. Harcourt. Too tidy, perhaps." Craddock stood, determination flashing in his eyes. "I'll have him brought in again. We'll search the house, question the staff." "No," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "That won't do. Men like Lionel Harcourt never admit to sin when pride still shields them. He must be made to see himself as others see him. That's the only way such a man ever cracks." By afternoon, the rain had passed, leaving the world damp and heavy with the scent of earth. Miss Marple visited Old Hatch alone. The servants were subdued, whispering in corners. She found Harcourt in his study, the curtains drawn, his eyes fixed on the empty hearth. "Miss Marple," he said coolly, not rising, "I hear the matter is concluded. A tragic business, but I suppose justice has been served." "Justice," Miss Marple said softly, "is rarely so simple. It's like embroidery, one missed stitch, and the pattern unravels." She moved closer, her voice steady. "I've been thinking of your wife, Mr. Harcourt, of how she must have felt these past years, living under another name, fearing exposure, perhaps even hoping for forgiveness that never came." His mouth tightened. "She made her choices." "Indeed she did. But I wonder, Did you ever consider your own? You see, Lydia didn't hide only from shame. She hid from you. She knew that what you called love was only possession. And when her lover returned, perhaps she thought she might at last be free of both men. Harcourt's eyes flickered. You talk too much for a woman who doesn't understand. Oh, but I do understand, Miss Marple said gently. I understand that you went to the churchyard after Grace fled, that you found Ashcroft still alive. You couldn't resist finishing what she began. It was neat, clean, and final. Then you removed what linked him to you. His watch, his wallet, his letters. And when you saw the handkerchief fall from Grace's pocket, you left it where it lay. How very efficient. He stood abruptly. You've no proof of this absurd fantasy. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not yet. But the proof will find you, Mr. Harcourt, as it always does. The railway ticket in Ashcroft's coat, do you recall it? The 10:45 from Paddington. He bought two. Your name, I believe, was written faintly, on the second. He intended to leave with Lydia. Not blackmail, not vengeance escape. For a moment, the air between them stilled. Then Harcourt's composure cracked, the rage that had simmered beneath the surface at last breaking through. He wanted to take her from me again, he hissed. She belonged here with me. I made her what she was. I couldn't let him win. Miss Marple's expression did not change. And so you killed him, she said quietly. He sank back into the chair, face pale, voice trembling. You don't understand. I gave her everything, my name, my home, and she turned this house into a lie. Better a corpse in the churchyard than another scandal in my hall. By the time Craddock arrived, Lionel Harcourt sat motionless by the hearth, hands folded as if in prayer. He didn't resist when they took him away. Miss Marple remained by the window, watching as the car disappeared down the lane. The village would whisper again about pride, betrayal, and love gone rotten. But for her, the pattern was complete. She turned to leave, her gaze falling on a single object left on the table, the broken locket, cleaned and rejoined. Inside, two faded faces smiled faintly, forever frozen in the innocence before deceit. Miss Marple closed it gently and slipped it into her bag. Poor souls, she murmured, past midnight indeed. The following morning dawned pale and still. Yet beneath that calm hung an unease that even the song of sparrows could not disguise. Mary Mead, despite its habit of forgetting unpleasantness, had not yet digested the events of the previous day. Lionel Harcourt's arrest had stunned the village, not only for the crime itself, but for what it revealed that evil could wear the face of civility, polished manners, and good breeding. But for Miss Marple, the matter was not quite finished. There were always ripples after truth was dropped into the placid pond of deceit, and she had learned that the take-sense time, ripples often revealed what the stone itself could not. She sat by her window that morning, a letter unopened beside her teacup. It was from Inspector Craddock, delivered by hand, thanking her for her unofficial assistance and enclosing a short note. Case closed. The evidence is complete. Yet, Miss Marple did not open it immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the lane below, where Lydia Harcourt, no longer Mrs. Rudge, walked slowly, her black shawl pulled close against the wind. The woman's face was pale, her posture uncertain, as though freedom itself had left her hollow. Miss Marple rose, fetched her shawl, and stepped out into the morning. When she caught up with Lydia near the churchyard, the other woman stopped, but did not turn. You were right, Lydia said softly. He never forgave me. Even in the end, he wanted control. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Pride does not end with punishment, my dear. It ends with understanding, and very few people have the private courage to look at themselves so closely. Lydia turned then, eyes glistening. I thought hiding here would redeem something. I thought if I served him, if I lived quietly, I could undo the past. But I see now, it only kept his cruelty alive. They stood together near the gate where Peter Ashcroft had fallen. The grass had grown again, faint green blades bending in the wind. Lydia's hand trembled as she touched the old stone. "He was not wicked," she whispered. "Foolish, vain, perhaps, but he loved me. Lionel never could." Miss Marple placed a hand lightly on her arm. "And yet, my dear, you loved them both in your way. That is what binds most tragedies. Love, misunderstood." A long silence passed between them before Lydia spoke again. "They'll take me away, won't they? For lying, for deceiving the court, for being part of it all." Miss Marple shook her head. "The inspector has more mercy than you imagine, and there is no punishment left that life itself will not deliver. You have lost both the men who defined you. Now, perhaps, you may begin to define yourself." They parted there, Miss Marple walking slowly toward home, Lydia disappearing down the lane toward the railway station, where, in the soft drizzle, a single train waited. Miss Marple suspected she would never return. That evening, Inspector Craddock came to the cottage. He looked weary but satisfied, the lines around his mouth softened by relief. "It's all settled," he told her. "Harcourt's made a full statement. He's to be tried at the assizes. The vicar's wife has been released, her confession withdrawn. The Home Office has sent word to commend your remarkable insight." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I do nothing remarkable, Inspector. I merely observe what people fail to hide, and most people hide very little when one knows what to look for." He chuckled. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," she said, "but not easy. Human beings, Inspector, never change. They tell lies not to deceive others, but to protect themselves from truth." Craddock's expression grew thoughtful. "I suppose you're right, though I must say, this case it's shaken me. So many lives tangled in deceit. You'd think murder came from hatred, but in this village, it seems to come from love." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "Love is often the most dangerous motive of all. It convinces good people that their sins are justified. I've seen it before. I expect I shall see it again." The fire crackled softly, the shadows dancing along the walls. Outside, the rain began again, pattering against the window pane. For a while, neither spoke. Then Craddock cleared his throat. "There's one thing I still don't quite grasp. The railway ticket, the second one. You said it bore Harcourt's name. How could you have known that?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, I didn't. Not until he confessed. But I suspected. You see, men like Mr. Harcourt never act without purpose. When I found that timetable scrap marked past midnight, I realized it wasn't only a phrase, it was a meeting arranged between two people who shared a secret. The question was never who waited, but who arrived." Craddock laughed softly, shaking his head. "You make me feel like a schoolboy again." "You'll learn," Miss Marple said kindly. "You have what most men in your profession lack: humility. That, and a fondness for the truth." When he left, she tidied away the tea things, folded her shawl, and stood for a moment by the window. Across the village, lights flickered one by one as the world prepared to sleep. But she remained watching, thoughtful, her gaze resting on the faint glow of the church tower. The bell would toll soon, marking another hour, another turn in the unending cycle of human folly and forgiveness. Later that night, she sat at her small writing desk and opened a fresh sheet of paper. Her pen moved with quiet precision as she began a letter to her old friend, Sir Henry Clithering. "My dear Henry, I've been reminded yet again that the most dangerous crimes are not born of greed or malice, but of vanity, particularly when dressed in the trappings of love. We've had a dreadful affair here in Mary Mead, quite the sort that reminds one how fragile our moral order truly is. But the curious thing is, I find no satisfaction in its resolution. One sees so much tragedy that one ceases to think of justice as victory. It is, at best, the quiet settling of accounts between human weakness and divine patience." She paused, dipping her pen again before adding, "You would have enjoyed the puzzle, though not, I think, the people." For in this little village, Henry, the heart remains the most cunning murderer of all. She signed it neatly, blotted the ink, and sealed the envelope. Then, with her lamp turned low, she set it aside and looked once more through the window. A single figure was walking down the road, small and solitary against the mist. Lydia, perhaps, or only a memory of her. Either way, Miss Marple did not move to follow. Some mysteries, she knew, were best left to the night. The church clock struck midnight. Soft and solemn, Miss Marple smiled faintly, folded her hands in her lap, and whispered into the quiet, "And so ends another tale, forever past midnight." The following days brought a quiet stillness to Mary Mead, the kind that always settles after a storm has passed, but before the air has fully cleared. The villagers, though outwardly restored to their routines, carried in their glances the shadow of what had transpired. One could sense the unease beneath their politeness, the nervous pause when conversation approached the subject of Old Hatch or the churchyard. It was as if the entire village had conspired to bury the memory along with the dead man. But Miss Marple knew that memory, much like guilt, has a way of viand in tasses, seeping through the soil, no matter how carefully it is covered. She spent the next morning tending to her garden, the rhythmic snip of her shears a comfort to her thoughts. The roses had begun to bloom again, fragile yet defiant. As she worked, her mind replayed every moment of the investigation, not the crime itself, but what had followed. The murder was only the first wound. What intrigued her most was how the village had reacted to it. Mary Mead had shown its soul, and it was not as innocent as it liked to appear. At 10:30, a gentle knock came at her gate. It was Grace Clement. She looked thinner, paler, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, but her posture still carried that quiet dignity Miss Marple had always admired. "I thought you might not wish to see me," she said softly, "but I couldn't leave without thanking you." Miss Marple wiped her hands and gestured her in. "I was expecting you, my dear. Sit down. There's tea and lemon biscuits. I baked them yesterday, though I fear they're a little too crisp." Grace smiled faintly. "After everything that's happened, I hardly think I deserve tea, but it's kind of you." Miss Marple poured carefully, the clink of porcelain filling the silence. "Deserve has very little to do with kindness," she said, "and you've been through more than most could bear. I trust the vicar has been understanding." Grace's eyes lowered. "He's kind, in his way. But there's distance now. I can see it when he looks at me. Pity, perhaps, or shame by association. I suppose I can't blame him. A vicar's wife who hides her cousin and covers for a murder, it doesn't sit well with a sermon on forgiveness." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze thoughtful. "Forgiveness is never easy, Mrs. Clement. Not for the one who grants it, nor for the one who seeks it. But if it helps, I believe your actions were born from compassion, not deceit." Grace gave a faint, trembling laugh. "That may be true, but compassion has cost me everything." There was a pause, broken only by the ticking clock and the faint hum of bees outside. Then Grace leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you believe in redemption, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple set down her cup. "I believe people can choose again. They cannot undo what's done, but they can decide what they will be after it. That, I think, is the closest thing to redemption we're ever given." Grace nodded slowly, as if memorizing the words. She rose to go, then hesitated by the doorway. "There's one thing I still don't understand," she said quietly. "When you accused Lionel, how did you know? You had no proof then." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Proof, my dear, is only the final step. I had something better pattern. Men like Lionel always believe themselves cleverer than the rest. They hide too carefully, plan too perfectly. But perfection is unnatural. When the smallest detail appears too neat, one can be certain it's been arranged. I only had to tug one thread, and the entire tapestry gave way. Grace looked at her with a mixture of awe and sadness. I suppose that's what makes you remarkable. Not remarkable, Miss Marple said gently. Merely old enough to know what people are capable of. When Grace left, Miss Marple watched her disappear down the lane, a solitary figure wrapped in grey. The village would whisper about her for months, perhaps years. But in time, they would find a new scandal, as villages always do. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to walk to the church. It was there, after all, that the story had begun, and she found comfort in endings that returned to their origins. The air was cool and still inside, carrying the faint scent of polish and candle wax. The sunlight filtered through the stained glass, painting the pews with fractured colors. She moved slowly down the aisle, pausing near the lich gate visible through the window. For a moment, she closed her eyes and imagined that night again, the stranger waiting, the lamp flickering, the whisper of footsteps before silence fell. She knelt briefly, not to pray, but to think. Some crimes, she mused, were born not from wickedness, but from the slow corrosion of love. Pride had poisoned Lionel Harcourt. Guilt had silenced Grace Clement. Fear had destroyed Lydia. And yet, even in their ruin, there was something painfully human in them all. When she rose, she noticed a small figure by the entrance, Tommy Briggs, the paperboy, clutching his cap. "Beggin' your pardon, miss," he said, "but I found this by the gate." He held out a folded piece of paper, crumpled and slightly damp. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. It was a torn fragment of a letter, the ink faint but legible. "Forgive me if I leave tonight. I cannot live among graves any longer. Tell Miss Marple I am grateful." Lydia's handwriting. She read it twice, then smiled sadly. "Thank you, Tommy. You've done well again. You always seem to find what others overlook." He beamed under her praise, then hurried off down the path. Miss Marple looked out across the churchyard. The world was peaceful once more, but beneath that peace lay a quiet melancholy she could not quite shake. Lydia had gone, as she knew she would, perhaps to London, perhaps somewhere nameless. There would be no pursuit. The dead were at rest, and the living deserved their freedom. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire once more. The newspaper lay unopened beside her. She preferred not to read the court reports. She reached instead for her knitting, letting the soft rhythm of the needles fill the silence. The clock struck 8, then 9, and outside, the night deepened over the village. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. As the final stitches took shape beneath her fingers, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. The world, she thought, was full of small deceits and quiet tragedies. And yet there was beauty, too, in the way truth always found its way to light, no matter how long it wandered in the dark. The embers glowed faintly in the hearth. She set her knitting aside, folded her hands, and whispered, almost to herself, "Yes, the truth always waits, sometimes just past midnight."